Welcome to Biztech Technology Show, the show where we feature tech companies operating globally, talking about their solutions and how they make a difference to their customers' businesses. Today we speak to Nicholle Lindner. She's the General Manager and Regional Director, Asia Pacific at 10x Banking. Now, Nicholle, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Now, Nicholle, for a start, could you just give us an overview of 10x Banking and its history?
Okay. It's a really interesting history because it's not an old company at all. It was founded in the summer of 2016 by Anthony Jenkins, who is our obviously founder, chair and CEO. Anthony has had a storied career in banking. Prior to 10x, he was the CEO of Barclays Bank in the UK. And he had been preoccupied over his entire career as to how do we get banks to serve customers better and how technology can actually be enabled for true transformation. And obviously being, a banker his whole year, he had seen literally everything, the good, the bad and the ugly, in terms of trying to serve customers through many, many years as, people's interactions with their bank changed from, say, branch network banking all the way through to sort of internet banking, and now, of course, digital, always on, omni-channel banking. So he has seen it all. And one of the things that really inspired him to form 10x was there's got to be a way to make this 10 times better than it is at the moment.
Okay, so interesting. That's where the 10x came from. Now, Nicholle, you are brand new to the company. You've just joined the company this year. Tell us about why you chose to take the position at 10x.
I've always loved working in fintech. So I was, as you know, and as we've been speaking, a banker. I trained as a lawyer. I joined the graduate program in a big bank. First of all, starting, in the legal department, then working through on a rotational basis, decided that I really liked banking as a career rather than law, and spent almost the next 20 years of my life working in big banks. So I've worked at Commonwealth Bank, I've worked at National Australia Bank, and I've worked at Westpac. So, 5, 6,
3 out of the 4 big banks in Australia.
Exactly. I've never worked at ANZ, but I've never worked at Macquarie. But I guess I had, the best grounding that I could possibly get in terms of the Australian banks. So CBA, massive powerhouse in the Australian banking landscape, a very, very technology savvy bank. National Australia Bank, Australia's leading business bank, an incredibly good institution, now being run by Ross McEwen, who is just fantastic, who I knew from, his days at CBA. So we all sort of move around a little bit. And then finally, Westpac, where I was most recently and ran the cards and payments business there. So that was a fantastic role combining technology and banking because, as you know, payments has always been sort of the bleeding edge of fintech. It's generally where banks get their feet wet. Mm-hmm. And it was a very exciting time where we're doing things like contactless payments, before basically that they were rolled out to the public. So Westpac's been very innovative in a very consistent way. And of course now Westpac is, I guess, one of my clients. I've worked then since banking at Capgemini, where I've also had Westpac as a client, and at Unisys, where I've also had Westpac as a client. So I like to think that I've seen banks both from the inside and the outside, sitting on both sides of the table.
Yeah, and you've also done it through different lenses, as a consultant as well as a technology solution provider.
Vendor, yes, exactly.
And so you're ideally suited for the next question, really, because the Australian banking system essentially is dominated by the big four. But what are the challenges? And there are a lot of challenges that the Australian banks are facing in upgrading, transforming their legacy banking system, and of course, facing the challenges of neobanks, challenger banks, as well as fintechs. Could you just enlighten us to your perspectives about all this and how 10x plays its role?
Sure. Look, Australian banks, if you look at the history of Australian banking, generally you look at about, between 80 and 85% of the Australian banking market being dominated by 4 players, ANZ, CBA, National Australia Bank and Westpac. Now, they have grown over the years through acquisitions, mergers, bringing into their fold, other banks. So, for instance, CBA bought Bankwest in 2008, Westpac bought St George in 2009. They also have businesses in New Zealand that they've acquired. So they are very, very large. CBA, for instance, I think is, the 45th largest bank in the world, in terms of assets. So these are significant institutions, and they have been described as the 4 pillars. They are the 4 pillars of Australian banking. They keep the system stable. But over the last sort of 10, 15 years, you have seen, a desire, I think, for other players to come into the market. So APRA, through its regulatory arm, which governs the Australian banking industry, has made it easier over the last few years with open banking and also the ability to gain a banking license than it ever has been before. So you're seeing new banks enter, you're seeing banks start up as well in Australia. So some good examples of that are Judo Bank, for instance, which is a dedicated SME lending bank, which has actually been formed by a former National Australia Bank executive. So he saw a need, do you know what I mean, for a specific small business bank. And he started that off. He has a banking license and he's listed and he's doing extremely well. So you can see that that sort of thing would have been absolutely, impossible 20 years ago, things that are happening now. And of course, you've got other players coming in who potentially also could form very, very strong banking relationships. And to that end, I always put, the Googles, the Amazons and things like that. They have very big presences worldwide. If they were ever to enter the banking market, in a very, very serious way, they would also be contenders, obviously, to erode that. But what a lot of people forget about Australia is it also has a very rich regional banking and small banking, smaller bank market. So community-owned banks, credit unions, mutuals, there are a lot of those, so there are, 40, 50 of those institutions. There's also mid-tier banks in Queensland, such as Suncorp and Bank of Queensland. So it is an interesting market, but it still is very much dominated. It has been digital banking that has really changed that. It was very, very hard to break into unless it was a bricks and mortar play. Do you know what I mean? In the old days, you actually had to own real estate.
But again,
do you know what I mean?
This is, of course, Nicholle. And Nicholle, you've seen this because this has been enabled essentially by technology and by technologies like 10x to really taking advantage of the cloud to enable quick deployment and basically take advantage of serving niches which the big banks are not serving.
Absolutely. And the speed to market that the new tech providers can provide. So for instance, when I was in banking, it would routinely take us 6 months or more to launch a new product. With 10x, you can do that in 6 minutes. You can actually bring that market to you much faster. You can be more responsive. Customers are changing a lot faster too. The average life of a home loan now has gone, from 25 plus years, down to less than 10. As people change banks, they upgrade, they are constantly assessing their relationships. People have become a lot more savvy and a lot more active. There used to be a lot of inert customers in banking. You sort of banked where your parents banked, really. You got an account when you first started working, you had your salary paid into it, you got a home loan, and you did all that sort of thing really with the one institution. Now people have multiple banking relationships and they are able to shop around. And with open banking, of course, the market has opened to non-banks also to play in the financial services space, such as Afterpay.
And I was just going to ask you about Afterpay. How has the likes of Afterpay disrupted the Australian financial services industry, especially because it's grown so fast, so quickly?
It's been incredibly fast. So if you look at Afterpay and our other local player in that market, Zip, both of those companies have done incredibly well. They saw, what was basically a demographic in the market around young people, millennials, who wanted to shop but didn't necessarily want to own credit cards. And you've seen the same thing happening in Europe with Klarna and the dominance that it's had there. So BNPL is a worldwide phenomenon, but I am very proud to say Australia has definitely been at the forefront. So when Afterpay was founded, obviously, it was a fairly niche thing. It was only in a couple of merchants. Those guys have steadily built that out, as has Larry Diamond at Zip. They've now gone to the UK, they've gone to the US. Afterpay has been bought by Square, which has now become Block. Zip is in talks to acquire Sezzle, which is one of its competitors as well. So again, you've got this situation in a market where it runs very, very fast and it gets very, very hot. And then you see a period of consolidation happening. And it will be, the large players, I think, will absorb the smaller players, just as happened in the established banking. What I was talking about, when the largers bought the smallers, we're going to see that happening in the buy now, pay later. That's not to say there's still not growth in the market for niche players. There absolutely is, and there's plenty of really good ideas going around, but the technology, I think, is enabling everyone to be a banking entrepreneur now, whereas once you just couldn't be. The barriers to entry were too high.
And now, Nicholle, I want to bring you to the rest of APAC, because essentially, just going on what you just said of enabling anyone to really be an entrepreneur, some markets in the region are more open than others. What's the strategy? Your remit is Asia Pacific. What's the strategy for 10x in the region?
Look, what we're trying to do is establish through our headquarters in Sydney a very, very good beachhead by which to launch into Asia. So I've always seen Asia as far more complex than Europe. It's not one continent. It is diverse in terms of languages, religion, developing, nations, maturity of technology. There's also a large unbanked component in Asia, or underbanked component, and of course you would know this from Malaysia. Yes. There's sort of every type of customer, every type of business, that you could possibly imagine. What I'm seeing is Singapore is being instrumental through the Monetary Authority of Singapore in terms of granting licenses to fintech. They have been incredible in terms of their encouragement of the market. So I think Singapore is one of those markets that we just will absolutely have to be in. Kuala Lumpur, we've talked about, I feel, is probably one of the strongest markets. Thailand and Vietnam also are fabulous adopters of technology, and they're also great developers of technology in Vietnam. I've been there on a number of occasions and just been so impressed by the entrepreneurial spirit there and how people are bringing stuff to market. And the government there actually too is really encouraging of the fintech community. So I think those countries are absolutely ripe for 10x to start those conversations with. Markets like Indonesia have traditionally been a bit harder because obviously, there's data sovereignty issues there. We want to work creatively with them, in terms of, we're an AWS certified platform. How do we work with people like AWS, do you know what I mean, to bring the best of banking to countries like that? The Philippines is also a really interesting market. And then you've got, the north of Asia, which is in of itself an enormous deep market. So Hong Kong, Taiwan, which have very large, very well-established banks, a lot of them on very, very established legacy platforms. And then, of course, you've got Japan, home to some of the largest banks. So it is probably the most diverse market in the world, Asia.
So then where is 10x putting its money? Are you focusing on the legacy banks, or are you focusing on the neo banks, challenger banks, and the fintechs?
Really good question. So I think 10x's technology is absolutely adaptable. So we do not have a strategy that just serves the big end of town. We have got a strategy that whatever size bank you are, whatever stage of the life cycle, you're a startup, you're 150 years old, like somebody like Westpac, we can have a conversation with you around your needs. So because we're a cloud native platform, it's quite, good to think about how you'd like to scale. In the early conversations with us, we can sort of be with you there from the beginning. Or if you're a very well-established bank, we can actually talk to you about how you can be more efficient, how you can reduce your cost base, how you can be more innovative. So at both ends of the cycle and all points in between, we can actually have a really relevant conversation. So I can talk to banks that have, very small, numbers of customers, maybe 100,000, 200,000 customers, or I can talk to a bank that has, multiple million customers, and the story will be able to be adapted. The 10x story will be able to be adapted to whatever stage they're at.
And Nicholle, one of the interesting things that you mentioned is that anyone can be an entrepreneur. The democratization of technology with solutions like yours is interesting because technically, I could be a very small regional bank with an existing banking license. I could set up a dedicated virtual bank or digital bank, and I can serve the whole country. And you talked about some markets north of Asia. What comes to mind was when you were saying that was India. You could be a small regional bank, and suddenly you could offer bank services across India. And that's really what this is all about, isn't it?
Look, and I do agree. I mean, India is a really interesting market. I worked with India extensively when I was at Capgemini. Mumbai is one of my favorite cities in the world. I love the energy that's in India and the software development that happens in it, and the entrepreneurial spirit in India, I think, is probably amongst the best in the world. Traditionally, Indian banks have been very, very much bound by their regional structures. So you have banks that only, to your point, operate in their little particular patches. We've changed all that with cloud native banking. As you say, on an app, you can be accessing, a population that goes far beyond what your natural reach would be. We're actually talking to banks at the moment throughout Asia who are actually just purely going to be, remote banks. They're just going to be purely electronic. They will never, ever have a branch network.
And that's really key to that, because essentially, as you mentioned earlier, financial inclusion is a big part of what governments are really looking at in terms of enabling technologies. So serving the underbanked and unbanked in the geographically spread countries, like, for example, the Philippines or Thailand, really, where they don't have the infrastructure. That's really the game changer for solutions like yours.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at it, setting up a banking network used to be extremely hard. Now anybody with a phone can basically access banking. And if you look at the number of phones in India, for instance, everybody has a phone, regardless, of what socioeconomic strata they come from.
Yes.
And that means that they can access financial services, which they never could before. And microservices around, micro banking, for small business, I think is really critical in economic areas like Malaysia, Philippines, India, where the majority of people aren't employed by big corporations. They have small family businesses, or they're sole operators, or they're contractors. Having a way to manage your money, on your phone and have it as an app, is game changing for them. It's one of the things that I always found interesting was, when people asked, oh, when will cash disappear? When will checks disappear? There was always that. And the thing was, I didn't think that they would necessarily disappear, but they would be replaced. You know what I mean? Something would come along which made them no longer obligatory. The banks weren't going to have to push that themselves. The consumers were going to do that. The minute a solution came along, and that's come along through digital banking and, peer-to-peer payments, international remittances being so much easier. There are so many players in that market. You look at TransferWise and how effectively they've tapped into that market, which was dominated by banks. So you can see these things that banks used to do that they had such a hold on, almost like a monopolistic, position, are being constantly eroded now by new players coming in. So it is very disruptive. If you're in a bank at the moment, you are absolutely feeling, disrupted and looking around and just thinking what's going to come at me next.
Absolutely. Now, Nicholle, I want to zoom in back to 10x now and your leadership position in the APAC. What are your focus areas for 2022?
Look, I think that there's a couple of key areas. One, of course, is to build 10x out as a brand and as a presence in this region. So we started here only 2 years ago in Sydney with a key client, one key anchor client. We are very, very keen, obviously, to make sure that we do absolutely everything we can to continue to build that relationship out, that relationship being, of course, with Westpac Banking Corporation. The thing also that I would be very, very keen to do is build out our footprint in terms of the different services that we can offer. So at the moment, we offer and are known for banking as a service, but we also offer Supercore, which is a fabulous core banking module, and that can help banks run all their existing legacy offerings, plus things like open banking. So it's not just we're a neobank, do you know what I mean, that can sit out on the side. We want to be working with the banks in Asia Pacific and Australia and New Zealand first from the inside out, delivering benefit, do you know what I mean, to them. So, I think the conversation is one that is going to be very much customer led when we're talking to customers at different stages, of their technology journey. We'll be looking at how we can understand their strategy, what's really important to them, it on a, cost saving basis, an efficiency basis, a better customer service basis, an acquisition basis. All banks have different priorities, but one thing is common, and that is everybody wants to serve their customers better. So that's where we want to bring that conversation together.
Nicholle, it's been a fascinating conversation. But before we leave, any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I think that, one of the things with technology is that it's always been a fast-moving place to work. That's part of the reason we love it. But it's getting faster and faster and faster, and it shows no signs of slowing down. And if you look at the amount of change that's happened in the last 5 years, I think it's the equivalent to what happened in the last 100 years or something like that, in other industries. So having a good partner, having a trusted partner like 10x, where you can experiment, innovate, work together, and bring through a software as a service model constant innovation and constant new offerings to your bank and your customers, I think is going to become more and more important. So, from my perspective, please reach out. I think we're very, very eager to hear from banks throughout the region, be they large, small, young, old, and see where we can actually work with you as a partner.
Now, Nicholle, thank you very much for taking your time to be on the show.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Now, I'm Brian Fernandez, and we've been speaking to Nicholle Lindner, the General Manager and Regional Director, Asia Pacific at 10x Banking, on Biztech Technology Show. This video and podcast will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our social media platforms. Thank you very much for tuning in.